So I've done a couple of XNode videos now, and as useful and versatile a system as it is, I'm sure it's at some point given you cause to go, yes, well, nice as it is, it doesn't look very good. What if I wanted to look more the way I want it to? Well, fear not, citizen. Your prayers have been flanswered. Net-flanswered, that is. Today I'm going to show you a few things that you can do with the Unity editor namespace and the XNode system to make your nodes look more like you want them to. I'm going to be abstractly walking through the creation of a node that looks like this, and in the interests of this video not taking a million years to make, I'm going to do a step-by-step thing of all the individual parts, then you can put them together to make your own stuff. I'm going to assume you know a little bit about C#, because otherwise we'll be here forever, but this is still going to probably be my longest XNode video, so I'm going to say this at the outset. I am happy to take questions in the comments and on Twitter, so if anything here doesn't make sense, I can go into more granular detail. Otherwise, if these videos are at all helpful to you, make sure to arbitrarily make my statistics go up by subscribing, so that my brain can go and share them amongst the rabble of peasants that you call friends. Before we can get into editing our node at all though, we need to briefly talk about some setup. Unless you tell it otherwise, by default, Unity will draw inspectors and component editors for you. When I'm talking about those, know that I'm talking about these, the little component slots you get on the sidebar when you select game objects. These are already pretty good as far as they go, but sometimes, and in particular for custom scripts that you write, you may want them to do more. To handle that, you need to write scripts that override how Unity draws your elements. To do this, you can create a script called a property draw, or at least usually you would if you were working in the inspector. XNode has a version of this called a node editor, but for our purposes they perform more or less the same function. XNode's documentation says to save these scripts in an editor folder. Apparently that's important. I haven't tried not doing that, so I'd advise on the side of caution. Anyway, yeah, create a script and name it something memorable. An important note is that this script is going to be responsible for redrawing the inspector for a certain component type. So if you're wanting to customize the dialog node, a name like dialog node draw, for instance, would probably be sensible. Inside the script, we're going to do a few things. First, we want to inherit from Unity editor, because we're going to be using a lot of the functionality from that to customize this node in a minute, as well as XNode obviously, and also XNode editor. We'll also want system.link, but that's because we're going to be working with enumerables later, and I hate them, and I'm not strong enough. Anyway, this gives us access to all the scripts we need to make stuff happen. Next, we need to tell Unity what component we'd like it to redraw. To do this, before the public class line, write in square brackets custom node editor, and then parenthetically type of dialog node. Now when we do our GUI calls in a minute, Unity will know to override that component in particular. I'm going to commit some crimes. Finally, we want to do a call to onBody GUI. The whole point of us calling this is we're overriding the existing functionality. For more on overrides, check out either of the last two videos because I get into it there too. Keep crying. In the course of using the GUI, we're going to want to change some of the values of the underlying dialog node. To do that, we need to tell the GUI what dialog node to point at. We can do this easily enough. Create a private dialog node variable at the top called dialog node, then at the start of our onBody GUI function, simply assign the value of the target, whatever that is, to it. Target doesn't know to be a dialog node though, so it's important to tell it to be through the asDialogNode follow-up. Also, add serialized object.update. I haven't worked out why this is important yet, but if you don't do it, I think stuff breaks, so just trust me on that one. Congratulations! If you followed these steps to the letter, you've broken all the functionality of your editor. Well, thanks for watching guys. Make sure to slam into that subscribe button with your car at 30 miles an hour. Let's get started. First of all, you're probably curious about the color scheme. Well, as it turns out, I actually don't need to do anything code-wise to change the colors if I want the same one on all of them. XNode has native support for that. If you right-click in the XNode panel, or if you click through the Edit Preferences dialog, you'll have a tab called Node Editor that lets you set the tint of your nodes, the color of your node ports on a variable type by variable type basis, and so on in that fashion. You can also make your connection lines be straight or angular or whatever instead of wobbly if that's what you want, I don't mind. But let's say that's not good enough. You want to be able to have different colors on a node-by-node basis. Make the dialog node look different from the Among Us node or whatever else you've got going. Well, there's a way to do that too. Breaking my own rule of focusing on the dialog node immediately in this video, I also have a node called stop node. It's not really relevant, but this basically makes the dialog stop. Fascinating, I know. Anyway, you'll notice that the stop node and the dialog node are different colors. This is very easy to achieve. If you go to the script for your node, not the draw, the actual node logic itself, and add a node tint attribute at the top with the hex color code for whatever color you want in the brackets, then come back out, you'll see the color of the node is updated. You can also color individual elements using GUI.background color. This is a little more complicated.
Some sort of clue!
Let's say we have a GUI button that opens the secret hatch in my room to the compartment that I keep all of my hostages in, and I want that button to be red. To do it, add a line that assigns GUI background color to equal color.red. That works, but you'll immediately notice we've got a problem. We've made all the other nodes red too. Don't panic. or do, I don't care. We can rectify this by simply capturing the value of GUI background color before reassigning it, and then once we're done having GUI elements be that color, we can revert it by assigning that original value back to it. As far as width is concerned, you can also do that through an attribute, node width. Simply give it a float value for the number of pixels wide you want it to be, and job done. You may have noticed, by the way, that that compartment that I'm keeping all of my guests in is still shut, but I haven't told the button what to do yet. I don't really feel like feeding them today though, so instead let's make the button hide our entry node port here. This port exists to connect previous nodes to this one, but since this is going to be the first one in the sequence, we're not really fussed about it being there, and to be honest, it kind of just takes up space. Create a button with GUI layout dot button, and then in the brackets, type out what you want the button to say. I quite like the red color scheme, so I'm going to keep it. You'll notice if you hover over the GUI layout dot button function though, it has a return type of bool. This is going to be very useful to us because it's what's going to enable us to give this button functionality. That bool is true when the end user clicks the button. This means, like in any other Unity context, we can run code when it does. In this instance, we want this port to disappear if we click the button. To make the port appear, we write this line of code. We need to make sure that this string matches exactly the name of the int in the logic script for the node, otherwise it'll cry. The best part is this: if we create a new boolean calling it show entry node or something and have it default to true, then wrap the property line in an if statement that checks whether that bool is true, all we have to do to make the button show or hide the entry node is have it flip the value of it. That's what this operator does, for what it's worth. And here it is. This works for both displaying and hiding UI elements, but also running other functions too. Go wild. The world is your oyster, etc., etc. The next step in our Minecraft Let's Play is to create these two new foldout menus. We'll fill them in a second, right now we're just worried about getting them to appear at all. This is probably the easiest thing to do yet created by humanity. It's similar to the button thing in that creating a dropdown returns a boolean, which is true if it gets clicked on. We'll worry about that in a second, but for the sake of saving ourselves time later, we're going to hook up all the infrastructure now. Create another private boolean at the top, this time defaulting to false, and call it something like, I don't know, show dialog settings, given that's basically what we're doing. Next, in the course of onBody GUI, type out show dialog settings equals editor GUI layout dot begin foldout header group, passing it the same show dialog settings variable so it knows what bool it should check to see if it's open or not, and then a string that tells it what label to display, in this case just dialog settings. Now when you go back to Unity, you'll see everything is working perfect. So this is another thing that's important to remember. If you open a group, like a vertical or a fold-out header group or something, it's important you close it because otherwise you get stuff like this. Fortunately, closing it is really easy. You just type editor GUI layout.end fold-out header group. Now we just want to make sure it only displays its contents when it's open. This is the same thing as the button. Just put an if statement in between your begin and end calls, and then later, when we want to put stuff inside the fold-out group, we can just slot it in there. Easy mode. Repeat this process for all the fields that you want. For what I'm working to, 2 is fine. Now, as nice as we're getting this to look already, we probably want to actually be able to interface with this so that our node data changes based on our actions. Something I'd like to be able to do is set the sprite that appears when a given person is speaking. Sure, you can do this through the default node, but you want to get a view of what, like, the name of the sprite is, and it would be better if we could get a preview. Fortunately, we can. In fact, it only takes one line using the object field function. The first parameter is what label we'd like the field to have, then what we'd like the contents to be assigned to, then what type of object it is, in this case a sprite, and finally the word true. I forget why the word true is there at the end, but I think it was important, so just leave it in, don't worry about it. For some reason, the parser will get real upset with you if you don't cast the whole method to a sprite, even though so make sure to cast it to a sprite. Also, if you wrap the whole thing in our if show dialog setting statement, you can have it so it's only visible when the foldout is open. The only problems now are that the label doesn't quite complete because it doesn't have enough space, and for some reason the image gets offset if you zoom out. I haven't figured out the latter issue yet, I'll get back to you on that, but the former is easily fixed. To set how wide you want the labels to be, simply update the value of editor GUI utility.label width to the width that you want. Bear in mind that this will change it for everything that comes after, so if you only want it in this particular instance, make sure to capture its value before changing it and revert it after you're finished. This works for any time the label gets cut off too early, by the way, so play around with it. We can now do the same sort of thing for our dialogue and speaker lines. For text, Unity Editor has a function called text field, which creates, you guessed it, a text field. You can create it as simply as passing it a label and what you want it to contain, in our case the speaker text. Make sure to assign it to the value of speaker also so that the node is updated when you type into it. For dialogue, we'd like the text area to be a little bigger than one line. Fortunately, we can do that too. First, create another property field in our dialogue node draw script connecting it to the dialog variable, which is the string variable that contains our dialog as the name implies. Then if we go back to our dialog node script proper, we can add a text area attribute to our dialog variable. Those numbers are the max and min lines that the text area will use. I've set the former to 3 because I only wanted to display that many. Any more than that and it starts getting a bit busy for me. Then if we go back to Unity, you'll see that we now have a much bigger space to work with, much more user-friendly, looks much nicer, everyone wins. Especially me, because you've watched this much of the video, which is a bit of a miracle. So hey, cool, we're making pretty good progress. We're really getting somewhere right now. Next, we're going to bring in some XNode stuff to tie it all together, and this is going to be the complicated bit. Probably. I don't know. Who cares? While the system as it stands already works for setting up, linear dialogue, the dialogue system I've written also has support for branching paths. What I'd quite like is to be able to visualize those paths in the graph using XNode's node ports and noodles. That's what those lines are called, by the way. They're called noodles. So first step, I forgot to put in the exit node, so let's have Unity visualize that for us. Adding the same kind of line for the entry port as we did earlier will do the trick. Already things are much clearer. However, you'll notice here between Scout from TF2 telling you not to pay your taxes and you winning The Apprentice Season 17, there's a break. There aren't any lines connecting these two nodes. Well, actually, as luck would have it, there are. You just can't see them because we haven't told Unity to display them yet. So let's do that now. I've written a subclass in my dialog node called dialog option. Dialog option is a class that has two variables, both strings. One is the actual text of the option, what choice we want the player to be able to make. The other is what port we should use if the player picks it. In this case, famous libertarian Gale from Digital Devil Saga has told us not to pay our taxes. We have the option to tell him that we will do as he asks and not pay our taxes, or that we simply have to pay our taxes in order to ensure the maintenance of public services. The actual content isn't important. What we'd like to be able to do is visualize those choices in the grid, as I said. First of all, let's set it up so that we can show or hide our dialog options at will. Dialog node contains a boolean that is true if the current node should prompt the player to pick something, so we can kill two birds with one stone on that front by adding a toggle. A toggle is like a button, except it's more like a checkbox, where if you check it, it stays true until you uncheck it, unlike a button where if you click it, it's only true for that long. So it's actually nothing like a button. Next, we want to display our dialog options if it comes out true. Setting up that functionality is easy enough as before. We can set things to be shown or hidden depending on whether the relevant bool is true. First step, let's make the node ports visible if we check the box. XNode editor makes this very easy. We create a for each loop for all of the node ports and the dynamic outputs of the current node, and I'll get into why we're doing that in a second. And then for each one we find, we create a new port field using XNode's implementation. This gives us something that looks like this, and you can see we've now unbroken the chain. We do have an issue though. We don't have any way to change what the dialog options are. It would be nice if we could add and remove ports at our discretion, but how do we do that? Well, fear ye not, because life finds a way. Under our node settings menu, let's make a UI that can create and remove ports. We only need output ports in our dialog drawer, so let's not worry about making it go both ways, though expanding it to do that is simple enough. To start, we should create a menu for naming the new dialog option and what output it should go to. We can do that by creating two new text fields. You remember us doing that before, right? Yeah, cool, good. Okay, we'll skip explaining that bit then. Do remember to make two new variables for these factors though, the dialog option and the output at the top, and then the text fields should assign to those variables. A side thing I should mention here, if you want the labels to appear on the previous line from the text field itself, you can use these things called prefix labels that are basically their own object, but will still sort of pin to whatever you put after it. Then we add a button with a create new option label on it. Clicking this will create the new dialog option, or at least it will once we're done coding it. If you did all that right, you'll be looking at something like this. Well done. Now the hard bit. Two things need to happen when we press that button. The first is it needs to make a new port amongst the existing ones, and the second is it needs to add a reference to the new option in our dialog options list. We can do both of those things, but we also need to bear in mind that this is a process that has some points of failure that we should account for. First, what do we do if the user presses the button, but they haven't filled in one of the two text fields? That would be annoying, but we can write a catch for that. Here's how we do it, and it's pretty cool, I think. We create two new local booleans, one for if the dialog box is empty and one for if the dialog box option is empty. Then we test for them in succession. If we detect either to be true, we know that something isn't right and we can alert the user accordingly. To alert them, we can call the editor_utility.display dialog function, which creates a mini error message window, which is quite fun. You can customize everything it says too, so you can, be whatever level of irreverent your personality matrix allows. This leads us to our next question. What if the player tries to enter a port name that already exists? We could feasibly say, well, okay, that means both options should go to the same endpoint, but in this brief, that isn't something I'm really that keen on, so I'm going to disallow it. Feel free to implement it in your own way though if you would rather, just know I'll be very disappointed in you. To do it my way, we need to run a check of the dialog option against the field name of every existing dynamic output, which again, don't worry, I haven't forgotten. I will explain why those are important in a second. To check it against all the ports, we can just do the same thing as before. Run a for each loop against each individual port in the dynamic outputs list, and if one of the field names matches the one we gave in the output field, we can just crash to a similar message. You could also add a character limit if you felt that way inclined, but I don't want to, so I'm not gonna. Make sure to add a return statement to all your checks, by the way, because we want to be certain we aren't still trying to process it anyway if we've spawned an error. Now that we've done all that, we can start implementing our logic. At this juncture, you now get to find out what a dynamic output is. Dynamic inputs and dynamic outputs in XNode parlance are ports that can be added and removed from a node dynamically. A-tier explanation, I know, but basically they're important in this instance because, by contrast to static ports, you can generate them in runtime rather than having to specify them in code. This means we can create them using the little button we have. The process of doing that is calling the add dynamic output function of dialog node, the private variable we specified at the top. The function takes 4 arguments. The first is what type of port it should be, and in this case it doesn't really matter because at the end of the day we're using it as a connector, but for consistency's sake set it to an integer if you're that way inclined. Then it requests a connection type. This sets whether it can connect to multiple nodes. If you wanted to be able to do that, set the connection type to multiple. After that, it asks you to give it a type constraint. This limits what node port types this one can connect to. For instance, you could set it up so that it can only connect to ports that are also integers. In this case, in context, it doesn't really matter what it can connect to, so probably set it to none. Finally, the field name. This is the bit we put in the new dialog option output field. Fill this out, and if you click on the button, you should find under dialog options your new port. You'll see that it hasn't added it to our list of dialog options though, which is a problem. We also currently don't have a way of getting rid of it. Both of these are easily fixed, but the first one is easily fixeder, so we'll tackle that first. In this context, we'd merely add a reference to both of the strings we set up in the dialog option list. We also want to be able to get rid of dynamic node ports and their connected dialog options if we want. What would be fun is if we could show both the add and remove functions in the node settings area, but only show one at a time. There's a neat way of setting that up called tabs, and yeah, I meant to talk about this earlier, but there's not much to say. Creating tabs is a bit like creating fold-out groups, but horizontally. What a genius commentary, I know. So to do, you set up a private int variable at the top of the script, and in this instance we'll call it, I don't know, current node tab or something to indicate that the number is meant to be a reference to whatever menu we currently have open. Next, under our if statement for the node settings fold-out group being open, we assign the value of current node tab to the GUI layout.toolbar function, which takes 2 arguments. The first is the integer itself, which tells it which tab to have appear highlighted, and the second is an array of strings, which is the various and sundry labels for all the tabs you wanted to have. In our situation, we only need 2, add output and remove output. Maybe we'll also have rename output or something in a future build, but let's not worry too much about that for now. After we've set that up, we can run a switch statement with the integer we created. Case 0, which is if the add node tab is selected, we can copy paste in our logic for creating new outputs. Case 1, which is if the remove node tab is selected, we'll need new UI, which we'll make now. Essentially, all we need is a drop down of all the dynamic outputs that exist in a button that says delete. Let's start with the drop down. Oh yeah, also, yeah, Unity Edit has a lot of stuff in it, which is why this video will take about a year for me to finish completely, or maybe like a week, let's hope. First of all though, we won't be able to display anything if there are no dynamic outputs. Instead, we should just put a system message letting the user know that there aren't any. First, let's put an if statement checking how many dynamic outputs there are by calling the count method of dialognode.dynamicOutputs. If the count returns 0, we know there aren't any outputs to delete, meaning we can just show a little message. To show a message, we can just call the editor GUI layout.helpBox function, specifying what message to display and what kind of help box to show. It's not an error exactly, more so just like something the user should be aware of, so I've set the message type to warning, but you can also set it to info if it's just informational, or error if something has gone wrong. Assuming there are dynamic outputs for us to interface with, we should list them. Unity Editor uses the editor GUI layout.popup function to handle this, which takes an integer and an array of strings. The integer is the index of the chosen array to display in the pop-up, and then the array is what strings should be displayed in the list. Makes sense, I trust. The problem we've got is that we can't easily convert from node port to string. So we'll need another for each loop to get all the field names and put them into their own list, which we can then turn into an array using the toArray function like this. As always, we can put the integer on both sides of the equation so that we can change which option is highlighted when we're using it. Once again, make another private int variable at the top called node port to delete or something and drop it in like before. Finally, we make another button, and if we click the button, we can remove the port. We do this by selecting the node port at the given index, which will match up 1 to 1 because of how we set the pop-up up, using the element_add function of the dynamic outputs list, and then just calling dialog node's remove dynamic port function on it. Job done. Except wait, not job done, because the dialog option is still there, so we need to run a for each loop on our dialog options to see if one with that port exists, and if it does, we need to delete that too. Now finally, if we click the button, the port is removed. Lastly, and I promise that this is the last thing before the node is like finished, let's show the dialog options we do have next to our ports at the bottom of the node there. That's easy enough. All we need is a prefix labeled with the dialog, a text field to edit the dialog, and a text field to display the output port. The thing is though, we don't want the end user to be able to edit the output port because that would break the whole system we've got going. Fortunately, it's very easy to prevent edits to it. Simply do not assign the value of d.option to the text field on the left side like usual. This means that no matter what edits you make, the text box will always have the right output in it. And that's really it for realsies now. It's done. You did it. go to bed. Except don't, because I forgot to mention there's a... I want to get more into graph customization in a future video, but for now one thing I'd like to share is how to add a button that lets you center a certain node in your view. You've probably seen the UI I set up in some of the other clips in this video, and now I'll tell you where it came from. I'm going to caution you here by saying that my solution is not perfect in the least and is not 100% accurate, but it'll give you a trial and error basis that will let you make something suited to your work. The first thing to know is that you set up a graph editor in the same way as you set up a node editor, more or less. Import all the right namespaces, add a custom node graph editor attribute this time, and make sure the class inherits from node graph editor. We're going to override the onGUI method this time rather than onBodyGUI. This is because whereas the nodes have both header and body GUIs, this only has like the GUI. Right. To create this window here, we need to do a few things that you're probably already familiar with at this point. First, all the setup stuff, add the serialized object call, yada yada yada. You'll also want to call base.onGUI. This will render the default version of the graph, which we probably want, because it'll mean we see like the grid and that, I think. I don't know. I'd like the window to have a background color, but you don't have to if you don't want. To implement our system, we need a reference to the last node that we selected. To make sure it works on any node, not just dialog nodes or stop nodes or whatever, make a private node called last node at the top of the script, and then in your onGUI method, make a new local node called targeted node. This is going to get assigned the value of selection.activeObject cast to a node type. This is because nodes have an inherent position value that tells us where they are on the grid. Selection.activeObject just returns whatever object Unity is currently selecting. This is good because it means now we can adjust the window position to fit where the quote-unquote camera would be if we were centering a given node. This is where it gets a little tricky. Assign the last node we created a minute ago the value of targeted node if targeted node exists. That is, we're actively targeting something with a node type. This means that even if we later deselect it, the system will remember that we had selected it and we can still make it center it. Then create a button. If we click on it, we want to center the last node if it exists, so check whether the last node is null, and if it's not, we need to do a bit of weirdo stuff to get it to work right. Step 1. Set the window zoom to 1. This will make the window zoom in as far as it can so we don't get any weird offsetting. Next, we're going to take the position of the node and run it through a bit of processing to make it work right. Create 2 new float values. These are going to contain the X and Y values of the node's position. However, we need to process it a bit because, at least on my system, passing this straight to the window makes it not work. Instead, because we're in Cloud Cuckoo land, if the X or Y values are negative or positive, we need to invert them. Don't ask me how it works. This code does that. I'm kind of tired at this point, so I won't get into how it works. I assume you can clock it. For more on ternary operators, check the link in the description. Now we can create a new vector 2 with those values and pass it to the window.pan offset. This is how far out from point 0, 0 on the grid the camera is pointing at. If we click center last node now, we'll see it's almost there, but it's actually pointing at the node's top left corner. This is because that's what the position value on the node refers to. To get it to center it, we'll need to offset it still further. I played with it a little bit and found that offsetting it by 150 pixels worked for me, but if you have wider nodes, you may experience oddness. Your mileage may vary. And yeah, that's all I've got. If any of this was helpful to you, make sure to subscribe, and also if you know a friend who can tolerate my editing who might find this useful, maybe send it to them also. The more viral marketing I don't have to pay for, the stronger I become. Soon these walls will not be able to hold me. Goodbye.